The morning fog had not yet lifted over the small town of Mason when Grace Mitchell parked her beat-up sedan in the parking lot of the county correctional facility. It was 6 o'clock on Monday morning. 18 years of working in the correctional system had taught her to appreciate these quiet moments before the start of her shift, when the prison was still asleep and the corridors were filled only with the hum of ventilation and the distant tapping of heating pipes. Grace locked her car and headed for the main entrance, the keys jingling in her hand. At 42, she looked stern and professional. Her dark blue uniform was immaculately ironed, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, no makeup except for a thin layer of foundation to hide her fatigue. Her colleagues called her the Iron Lady, and Grace was proud of that nickname. In a world where weakness could cost you your life, she had chosen strength. After passing through metal detectors and 3 checkpoints, Grace entered the administrative wing of the prison. The Mason County Correctional Facility was not large, with only 400 inmates, most of whom were serving sentences ranging from 2 to 10 years for medium-level crimes. Theft, drugs, fights, petty fraud, the usual fare for a small town in rural Ohio. "Good morning, Grace," greeted the guard on duty. A young guy, only 6 months on the job, he had not yet lost his illusions about the justice system. "Morning, Jacob." Grace nodded, taking her radio and keys. "What kind of night was it?" "Quiet. Only in the 3rd block Harris was causing trouble again, demanding an extra blanket. Other than that, nothing out of the ordinary." Grace knew Harris, a small-time drug dealer who thought prison was a health resort. She had seen hundreds like him. They came from the streets where they fought for survival every day, and in prison they got 3 hot meals a day, a roof over their heads, and medical care. Some didn't even want to be released. On her way to her office, Grace passed the medical wing. Through the half-open door, she could hear Dr. Elsa Chen talking to someone on the phone, discussing test results. Elsa had been working at the prison for 5 years, and Grace respected her professionalism. Unlike many doctors who viewed working in correctional facilities as a temporary refuge, Elsa genuinely cared about the health of the inmates. Grace's office was located on the 2nd floor of the administrative building. It was a small room with a metal desk, 2 chairs, and a bookcase with personal files. On the wall hung certificates of advanced training and a photograph from the award ceremony 5 years ago when she was named Employee of the Year. Standing next to her was her husband Robert, smiling at the camera. Now that photograph was just a reminder of what was left behind. The divorce had been finalized 2 years ago. Robert had left her for his secretary, a cliché story that nevertheless divided Grace's life into before and after. 18 years of marriage, plans for the future, dreams of children, all collapsed in one night when she discovered her husband's correspondence with his mistress on his phone. Grace turned on her computer and looked through the weekend reports. Nothing unusual. A couple of fights in the dining room, a homemade knife confiscated from an inmate in the 1st block, the standard set of internal violations. She filled out the reports mechanically, her thoughts wandering. Loneliness had become her constant companion. The house in the suburbs of Mason that she and Robert had bought now seemed too big and empty. She spent her evenings in front of the TV with a glass of wine and her weekends gardening or cleaning. Grace tried to find a hobby, signing up for a pottery class, but quickly gave it up. The only thing that really occupied her mind was her work. At 8 o'clock in the morning, there was a knock at the door. Douglas Hill, the head of the institution, entered, a heavy-set man in an expensive suit who was always more concerned with the prison's reputation than with the well-being of the inmates. "Grace, we have a new arrival," he said, placing a folder of documents on the table. "Marcus Reynolds, 35 years old, burglary, 5 years, first time in prison." Grace opened the file. The photo showed an attractive man with dark hair and attentive eyes. Education, 2 years of college, worked as a car mechanic. No previous convictions, but his marital status was listed as divorced. "What did he steal?" Grace asked, leafing through the documents. "Broke into the district judge's house." Douglas grinned. "Seems like the guy isn't very smart when it comes to choosing targets. The lawyer asked for the minimum sentence, but the judge wasn't in the mood to be lenient." Grace studied the psychological profile. Reynolds was described as charismatic, manipulative, but not aggressive. The prison psychologist noted his ability to win people over and recommended placement in a general population unit with minimal security. "When is he coming in?" Grace asked. "He's on his way. Should be here by noon." After Douglas left, Grace continued to study Reynolds' case. Something about his history caught her attention. Perhaps it was the fact that, like her, he had been through a divorce. Or perhaps it was that there was no mention of violence in his case file, which was rare for inmates in their prison. By noon, the convoy arrived. Grace watched from her office window as the new prisoners were led out of the van. Reynolds stood out among them. He stood straight, looking neither intimidated nor aggressive. When the guards removed his handcuffs, he rubbed his wrists and looked around the prison grounds with curiosity rather than fear. The intake procedure took 2 hours. Medical examination, photographing, fingerprinting, issuing prison uniforms. Grace watched the process through the video surveillance system. Reynolds answered questions calmly and even smiled at the guards. This behavior could mean one of two things. Either he really wasn't a threat, or he was an experienced manipulator who knew how to hide his true nature. Dr. Elsa Chen conducted the medical examination quickly and professionally. There was nothing unusual in Reynolds' medical records. He was in good physical condition, had no chronic illnesses, and did not use drugs. Blood tests showed normal results. After lunch, Grace went down to the residential block where Reynolds was being held. Second floor, cell number 23. His neighbor was Jenkins, an elderly man serving time for tax evasion. He was a quiet, unproblematic inmate. "Reynolds," Grace called as she approached the cell. Marcus got up from the bottom bunk. Up close, he looked even more attractive than in the photo. He was tall, athletic, with a confident gaze and a slight smile. "Yes, ma'am," he replied politely. "I'm Senior Guard Mitchell. I'd like to explain the rules." "I'm listening." His voice was pleasant, with a slight Midwestern accent. Grace noticed that he was looking her in the eye, not looking away, a sign of either respect or defiance. "It's simple here," she began her standard speech. "Follow the rules and you'll be fine. Break the rules and you'll go in solitary. Get into a fight and you'll get extra time, got it?" "Crystal clear, ma'am. Can I ask a question?" Grace nodded. "When can I sign up for the library? I'd like to educate myself." An unexpected question. Most newcomers were interested in food, walks, or phone calls. "See Mr. Jenkins tomorrow morning," she said, nodding to her cellmate. "He'll show you how to sign up." "Thanks. Also, is there any way I can work in the workshops?" "You can apply in a month. You need to settle in first." Reynolds nodded and smiled again. There was something appealing, almost charming, about his smile. The rest of the day passed quietly. Reynolds behaved impeccably. He didn't get into any conflicts with the other inmates, waited his turn in the dining hall, and participated in the evening roll call without any problems. Grace caught herself watching him through the surveillance cameras several times. In the evening, at the end of her shift, she looked through his file again. Divorced 3 years ago, his ex-wife Linda was seeking alimony, but they had no children. He had worked at a car repair shop but lost his job due to the economic crisis. Loans, debts, despair, a typical story for many middle-class Americans who have fallen to the bottom of society. What drove him to crime? Despair, anger at the system, or just stupidity? Grace knew that many people commit crimes not out of natural malice, but out of desperation. Perhaps Reynolds was just such a person. Lost, not evil. As she left the prison, Grace glanced once more at the monitor showing cell 23. Reynolds was sitting on his bunk reading a book by lamplight. Something about the scene struck her as touching, a lonely man seeking solace in reading while the world outside the prison walls continued on as usual. The drive home took 20 minutes. The empty house greeted her with silence and the smell of air freshener. Grace heated up a frozen dinner, opened a bottle of wine, and sat down in front of the TV. News, commercials, talk shows, the familiar evening ritual of a lonely middle-aged woman. Before going to bed, she thought about the new inmate again. For some reason, the image of Marcus Reynolds would not leave her mind. Perhaps it was because he did not look like a typical criminal. Or perhaps it was because she saw something familiar in his eyes, the same pain and disappointment she herself had experienced. A week had passed since Marcus Reynolds' arrival, and he had already become a prominent figure among the inmates. Not because of aggression or conflict. On the contrary, his calmness and friendliness set him apart from the usual tense prison atmosphere. Grace watched as he easily found common ground with all sorts of people, helping elderly Jenkins sort out his legal documents, calming down young drug addict Tommy during withdrawal, even managing to negotiate with the local authorities for a fair distribution of phone time. "There's something special about this guy," Guard Jacob remarked as he and Grace watched Marcus explain the rules of prison life to a new inmate. "He hasn't complained once all week. He even helps us keep order." Grace nodded, her eyes fixed on the monitor. Marcus was indeed unusual. His behavior betrayed an intelligence and life experience that went beyond that of a simple auto mechanic from a small town. He read serious books, biographies, history, even philosophy. He had enrolled in several educational programs, computer literacy, accounting, and English literature courses. On Tuesday morning, Grace was conducting her weekly check of the cameras in the residential block. When she approached camera number 23, Marcus got up from his cot and greeted her politely. "Good morning, Miss Mitchell. I hope you're in a good mood on such a beautiful day." His smile was sincere, without the obsequiousness that inmates usually displayed when they saw their superiors. Grace felt something inside her respond to this simple human warmth. "Everything okay, Reynolds? How's the adjustment?" "Great, thanks for asking. I wanted to thank you for referring me to the library. Mr. Harrison, the librarian, was very helpful in choosing some books." Grace glanced into the cell. 3 books lay on a small table: A History of the American Penitentiary System, Psychology of Interpersonal Relations, and Steinbeck's East of Eden. "Interesting choices," she remarked. "I'm trying to understand the world I've found myself in," Marcus replied, his eyes meeting hers, "and how to be a better person when I get out of here." There was no pretense in his words. Grace had heard thousands of promises to reform from inmates, but they sounded mechanical, like a formula memorized for early release. Marcus spoke differently, thoughtfully, with a genuine interest in self-analysis. "Do you have any plans for the future?" she asked, even though such conversations were beyond the scope of her duties. "I want to get a college degree through a correspondence course. Maybe become a social worker or a counselor for people in difficult situations. I think my experience can help others avoid making the same mistakes I did." Grace was surprised by the seriousness of his intentions. Most inmates dreamed of returning to their old lives or simply of freedom. Marcus, however, spoke of serving society. "That's a worthy goal," she said, and continued down the hallway. But thoughts of her conversation with Marcus stayed with her all day. When was the last time she had met someone with such sincere intentions to change their life? Even her ex-husband Robert had never talked about lofty goals. He was only interested in money, status, and material possessions. On Wednesday, Grace stayed late at work, sorting through the reports that had piled up. It was already 8 in the evening, and most of the employees had gone home. The corridors were unusually quiet, broken only by distant sounds from the residential blocks. She decided to walk around the premises before leaving. A final check was part of her routine. Passing by the library, Grace saw a light in the window. Looking inside, she saw Marcus sitting at a desk with an open book, making notes in a notebook. He was so engrossed in reading that he didn't notice her presence. Grace knocked on the door and entered. "Reynolds, the library closed an hour ago." Marcus looked up, looking embarrassed. "I'm sorry, Miss Mitchell. Mr. Harrison allowed me to stay late and said he would notify security. Apparently, there was a problem with the communication system." Grace moved closer and saw that he was reading a book on trauma psychology and taking detailed notes. Preparing for exams? Studying for a correspondence course to get into college. "I want to understand how to help people cope with life crises." His hand holding the pen was well-groomed despite the prison conditions. Grace noticed a thin scar on his wrist, a mark from a watch or bracelet he had worn in his former life. "You're serious about this," she said, sitting down in a chair across from him. "What led you to this decision?" Marcus put down his pen and looked at her intently. "My divorce," he said after a pause. "When Linda left, I fell into depression. I lost my job, started drinking, and did something stupid that I'm now paying for. But here in prison, I've had time to think, to understand what went wrong." Grace felt an unexpected sympathy. His story was painfully familiar. "Divorce is hard," she said, more quietly than usual, "especially when you think things will be different." "Have you been through that too?" he asked delicately. Grace was surprised at her own openness. She never discussed her personal life with prisoners. 2 years ago, 18 years of marriage ended because of his infidelity. I'm so sorry. Being betrayed by someone close to you is the worst thing that can happen. There was genuine sympathy in his voice. Grace felt something warm inside her. It had been a long time since she had heard such words of support. "How are you coping?" Marcus asked. "Work helps. Here I feel needed, important. I know I'm doing something useful." "I can see that. The inmates speak of you with respect. Strict but fair. That's how they describe you." Grace was surprised. She didn't think the inmates spoke of her in such positive terms. "You're also trying to cope through self-improvement," she remarked, nodding toward the books. "Yes, but it's hard to do alone. Sometimes you need someone who believes in your intentions, someone who sees you as a person, not just a number in a cell." His words touched something deep within Grace. She too felt lonely. She too needed understanding and support. "I think you can do it," she said. "You have willpower and sincerity. Those are rare qualities." Marcus smiled, and his face lit up. In the light of the desk lamp, he didn't look like a prisoner, but like a normal, attractive man who was pleasant to talk to. "Thank you for believing in me, Miss Mitchell. It means a lot." Grace caught herself looking at him longer than she should have. A pause hung between them, filled with a special kind of tension. "It's time for you to go back to your cell," she said, rising from her chair. "Late roll call is in half an hour." "Of course. Thank you for letting me finish the chapter." As Grace walked him back to the living quarters, their footsteps echoed in the empty corridors. Marcus walked beside her, not behind her as prisoners were supposed to, and she didn't say anything. It was a minor breach of protocol, but it seemed natural. "Miss Mitchell," he said when they reached his cell, "can I ask you a personal question?" Grace nodded, even though she knew she shouldn't. "Have you ever thought about starting your life over? Changing everything?" "Every day," she replied honestly. "But I don't know where to start." "Maybe start small. Start by allowing yourself to be a person, not just an employee." His words sounded like a revelation. Grace had truly forgotten what it meant to be just a woman, not a supervisor, a boss, an ex-wife. "Good night, Reynolds," she said, locking the camera. "Good night, Miss Mitchell, and thank you for talking to me." At home, Grace couldn't sleep for a long time. Her conversation with Marcus had stirred up something long forgotten, a need for emotional closeness, for understanding, for someone to care about her inner state. When was the last time someone had been interested in her feelings and dreams? The next day, she found herself looking for Marcus among the inmates. He was sitting in the dining room with a book, discussing something with the librarian Harrison during their walk, and working intently on a project in the workshop. He was full of life and energy, unlike most of the inmates who were just serving their time. On Friday, Grace brought him an additional psychology book she had bought at a bookstore on her way to work. "I thought you might be interested," she said, handing him the book through the bars of his cell. Marcus took the book and read the title, The Path to Emotional Healing. "That's a very thoughtful choice," he said, flipping through the pages. "How did you know that's what I needed?" "Intuition," Grace replied, feeling slightly embarrassed. "You have wonderful intuition and a kind heart." Their fingers accidentally touched as he took the book, and Grace felt a strange excitement. It was inappropriate, wrong, dangerous, but she couldn't deny that she felt something more than professional interest for this man. The weekend passed in reflection. Grace knew she was crossing a line, but she couldn't stop herself. Marcus had awakened something in her that she thought was lost forever, the ability to feel desired and understood. On Monday, she came to work determined to restore professional distance. But when she saw Marcus in the hallway carrying a stack of books from the library and smiling at her so warmly and gratefully, all her resolutions crumbled to dust. "Welcome to the new week, Miss Mitchell," he said. "I hope it brings you many good moments." "Thank you, Reynolds. How's your studying going?" "Thanks to your book, I've learned a lot of important things about myself. Maybe I'll tell you about my discoveries sometime." There was an invitation to intimacy in his voice that was both frightening and appealing. Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. She knew she was standing on the edge of a precipice. One more step, and she would find herself in a situation from which there would be no return. but the loneliness that had accumulated over the 2 years since her divorce, and the unexpected emotional connection with this unusual prisoner were stronger than reason. For the first time in a long time, Grace Mitchell felt alive. 3 weeks had passed since their first private conversation in the library, and the relationship between Grace and Marcus continued to deepen. She found more and more reasons to visit his cell on official business, and he always greeted her with the same warm smile and attentive gaze. Other inmates began to notice the guard's special treatment of Reynolds, but no one dared to say anything. On Tuesday evening, Grace stayed late at work again. She knew Marcus would be in the library. It had become their unofficial tradition. When she entered, he looked up from his notes and smiled. "I was hoping you'd come," he said, putting down his pen. "I wanted to share something important with you." Grace sat down across from him, as usual. Over the past few weeks, she had grown accustomed to these evening conversations. They had become a bright spot in her monotonous life. "I got my answer from the college," Marcus continued, handing her the letter. "I've been accepted into the social work program as a part-time student." Grace read the letter and felt genuine happiness for him. "That's wonderful, Marcus. Congratulations." She called him by his first name for the first time, and it sounded so natural that they both fell silent, aware of the change that had taken place. "Thank you, Grace," he said quietly. "Without your support, I wouldn't have even tried." Using her name created a new level of intimacy. Grace felt her heart beat faster. "You did this. You have willpower and determination. But it's also important to have someone who believes in you," Marcus said, leaning closer. "Someone special." There was a tension between them that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Grace knew they were approaching a dangerous line, but she couldn't bring herself to back away. "Marcus, we shouldn't," she began, but he gently interrupted her. "Shouldn't what? Be human? Feel something for each other?" His hand slowly reached for hers, which was resting on the table. When their fingers touched, Grace felt an electric shock run through her body. "This is wrong," she whispered, but she didn't pull her hand away. "What's wrong with two lonely people finding comfort in each other?" he asked, intertwining their fingers. "We've both been through pain. We're both looking for meaning in life." Grace looked at their joined hands and felt all the barriers she had built over the years crumble. When was the last time a man had held her hand with such tenderness? "I think about you every day," Marcus continued. "About your eyes, your voice, how you care about people, even people like me. Marcus, tell me you feel something too. Tell me I'm not going crazy." Grace looked up and met his gaze. There was such sincerity, such tenderness in his eyes that she couldn't lie. "I think about you too," she admitted, barely audibly. Marcus squeezed her hand tighter. "Then let's not pretend there's nothing between us. Life is too short for pretense." For the next few minutes, they just sat there, holding hands and looking at each other. Grace felt like a teenager in love for the first time. Everything was new, exciting, and scary all at once. "I have to go," she finally said, but made no move to get up. "Stay a little longer, please." His voice was full of pleading, and Grace couldn't refuse. They spent another hour talking about the past, about dreams, about how difficult it was to start life over. Marcus told her about his childhood, about how his father left the family when he was 12, and how he vowed never to hurt a woman like that. "But I let Linda down," he said bitterly. "When I lost my job, I started drinking and became the very person I despised as a child." Grace saw genuine remorse in his eyes. "People make mistakes," she said. "The important thing is to learn from them." "You're so wise," he smiled, "and beautiful. Your ex-husband is a complete idiot." Grace felt herself blush. It had been a long time since anyone had paid her a compliment. The next day, she found it difficult to concentrate on her work. Her thoughts kept returning to Marcus, to their conversation, to the touch of his hand. She knew that what was happening between them was dangerous, not only for her career, but also for his future. If their relationship became public, he could get more time in prison, and she would be fired in disgrace. But when she found herself back in the library that evening, all rational arguments were forgotten. Marcus was sitting by the window, reading in the light of the setting sun. He looked so peaceful and attractive that Grace's heart melted with tenderness. "How's your studying going?" she asked, moving closer. "It's hard to keep up with the prison schedule, but I'm managing," he replied, standing up. "Grace, we need to talk." The seriousness of his tone alarmed her. "About what?" "About us. About what's going on between us." He moved closer to her, and Grace felt the warmth of his body. "I can't pretend anymore that you're just a guard to me," he said quietly. "You changed my life, gave me hope for the future. Marcus, we can't." "We can," he interrupted. "Right here, right now, we're just a man and a woman who found each other." He reached out and gently touched her cheek. Grace closed her eyes, enjoying the tender touch. "I've been alone for so long," she whispered. "Me too, but now we've found each other." He leaned down and kissed her gently. The kiss was tender, full of restrained passion. Grace responded, forgetting everything else in the world. When they pulled apart, they were both breathing heavily. "This is crazy," Grace said. "The most beautiful crazy I've ever known," Marcus replied. In the days that followed, their relationship became even more secretive and intense. Grace found ways to be alone with Marcus, in the library, in the medical office, under the pretext of checking on his health. They kissed, talked about the future, and made plans for when he was released. A week later, Grace decided to take the final step. She knew she was doing the wrong thing, but she could no longer fight her feelings. In the evening, when most of the staff had left, she took Marcus to her office under the pretext of having an important conversation. "Grace, what's going on?" he asked when she locked the door. Instead of answering, she walked over to him and hugged him. Their kiss was passionate, full of pent-up desire. Marcus held her tightly. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered. "I want to be with you." What happened next changed their relationship forever. In the silence of the office, surrounded by official documents and photos from award ceremonies, they became lovers. For Grace, it was a return to life after months of emotional emptiness. For Marcus, it was another step in his carefully thought-out plan. A week after their intimacy, Grace felt unwell. At first, she blamed it on stress and fatigue, but when the symptoms worsened, she decided to see a doctor. Dr. Elsa Chen, who also worked part-time at the city hospital, was surprised by her colleague's visit. "What's bothering you?" Elsa asked, inviting Grace into her office. "General malaise, fatigue, and sometimes a fever," Grace listed. "Maybe I'm just overworked." Elsa examined her and ordered blood tests. "The results will be ready tomorrow," she said. "It's probably nothing serious, but it's better to check." The next day, a phone call from Elsa shattered Grace's world. "I need to see you," the doctor said in a serious tone. "Come to the hospital as soon as you can." In Elsa's office, Grace saw the test results and felt the ground slip away from under her feet. "HIV positive," Elsa said quietly. "Grace, I'm so sorry." The next few minutes passed in a fog. Elsa explained modern treatment methods and the possibility of a normal life with the right therapy, but Grace could only hear the noise in her ears. "How is this possible?" she asked when she could speak. "We need to trace the possible sources of infection. When was your last sexual encounter?" Grace thought of Marcus, but couldn't tell the truth. Then she remembered Robert, their last months together, when he was already cheating on her. "My ex-husband," she whispered. "He had other women before we divorced." Elsa nodded understandingly. "Perhaps he contracted it and passed it on to you. Unfortunately, it happens." Grace felt panic rising inside her. If she was infected, then, Elsa, if I had contact with someone after I was infected, could they be infected too? Yes, the likelihood of transmission is quite high with unprotected contact. Grace's world was falling apart. Not only did she have an incurable disease, but she might have infected Marcus, the man she had fallen in love with. The drive home was a blur. When she got home, Grace collapsed on the couch and let herself cry. Her tears were bitter, from despair, from guilt, from fear of the unknown future. The next day at work, she felt like a robot. She performed her duties mechanically, avoiding Marcus. But he found a way to talk to her. "Grace, what's wrong?" he asked as she walked past his camera. "You look sick." She stopped. unable to pretend. "We need to talk," she said quietly. "Tonight, in the library." There was so much pain in her voice that Marcus knew immediately that something serious had happened. That evening in the library, Grace couldn't bring herself to start the conversation. Marcus waited patiently, holding her hand in his. "I'm sick," she finally said. "I have HIV." Marcus turned pale. "What? When did you find out?" "Yesterday. I got it from my ex-husband." She looked him in the eyes. "Marcus, I could have infected you." He was silent for a few seconds, digesting the information. "We need to get you tested," Grace said. "Right away." "Yes," he nodded. "Of course." But there was something in his eyes that she couldn't understand. Not fear, not disgust. Something else. Something cold and calculating. "Grace," he said, hugging her. "Whatever happens, we'll get through this together." But she already felt that something had changed. There was no longer the tenderness in his embrace that had been there before. And she began to realize that she might have made the biggest mistake of her life. A week had passed since Grace's revelation about her HIV infection, and Marcus had changed dramatically. The tenderness and understanding that had attracted her so much were gone. In their place were cold calculation and barely concealed demands. "Grace, I need to talk to you," he said during their next meeting in the library. His voice sounded businesslike, without the warmth of before. "Are your test results back yet?" she asked, hoping to hear good news. "They're back." Marcus took a folded piece of paper out of his pocket. HIV positive. Grace felt her heart break. She had infected him. She had condemned the man she loved to the same fate. "Marcus, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't." "Sorry?" He smiled, and there was nothing kind about it. "You ruined my life, Grace. Forever. We can get treatment. Modern therapy can help." "Shut up," he snapped. "You think I don't know what that means? Lifetime treatment, side effects, a stigma for the rest of my life." Grace had never seen him like this. All his charm and gentleness were gone, revealing something cruel and calculating. "But now we're in this together," Marcus continued, leaning closer. "And you'll do everything I say." "What do you mean? What do you think will happen if I tell the authorities about our relationship? About how a senior guard seduced an inmate and infected him with a deadly disease?" Grace felt a chill in her stomach. She knew where he was going with this. "Your career will be over, you'll go to jail. Or maybe even worse, I could be charged with raping a correctional facility employee. Do you know what they do to people like that in prison? Marcus, please. That's why you're going to be a very nice and obedient girl." His voice became almost gentle, but his eyes remained cold. "First, I need money in my account. $1,000 to start with. I don't have that kind of money. You'll find it. Second, you'll help me get out early. You have connections, influence. That's impossible. You've only served a month of a 5-year sentence." Marcus grabbed her wrist and squeezed so hard it hurt. "Nothing is impossible, sweetheart, especially when your life is on the line." Grace realized that she was looking at a completely different person. All their romantic encounters, conversations about the future, tenderness, it was all a carefully planned performance. Marcus had been playing with her from the very beginning, manipulating her loneliness and need for love. In the days that followed, he continued to make new demands. He asked her to smuggle contraband into his cell, give him information about other inmates, and grant him small privileges that he could use to strengthen his authority among his fellow prisoners. Grace complied with his demands, knowing she was trapped with no way out. But worst of all were his taunts about their past relationship. "Remember how you said I was special?" he sneered. "That I had a good heart? God, you're such a naive fool." Each word hit her like a whip. Grace realized she wasn't the first woman he had used this way. His manipulation skills were too refined for a novice. 2 weeks after the blackmail began, Grace realized she couldn't live like this anymore. Marcus was becoming increasingly greedy and arrogant. He demanded meetings in her office and threatened to tell the other inmates about their relationship if she didn't obey him. "You're my property now," he said during one of these meetings. and you'll do whatever I want until I get out of here." "And then?" Grace asked quietly. "And then we'll see. Maybe you'll be useful to me on the outside." Grace didn't sleep that night. She knew Marcus would never let her go. Even after her release, he would continue to blackmail her, demand money, and use her connections. She would become his slave for life. And then a terrible plan formed in her mind. The next day, Grace studied Marcus's medical records. He had no serious illnesses, but there were occasional complaints of headaches and sleep problems, typical symptoms of stress from adjusting to prison life. Dr. Elsa prescribed him mild painkillers and sleeping pills on demand. Grace knew where the medications were kept and had access to them thanks to her position. The utility room also housed a storage area with disinfectants and rodent control products. Among them was warfarin, a rat poison that, in large doses, caused internal bleeding and symptoms similar to a heart attack. The plan was simple and terrifying at the same time. Mix the poison into the painkillers that Marcus took from time to time. Death would look like sudden heart failure, not uncommon for young men under stress. Grace spent a week gathering her courage. Every morning, she woke up thinking she couldn't do it. But every day, Marcus reminded her of the hopelessness of the situation. He became even more cruel, humiliating her at every opportunity, making her feel worthless and pathetic. "You know what I like most about our situation?" he said on Thursday evening. "That you thought you had me in love with you. An old, lonely woman dreaming of a prince on a white horse, and all you got was a nightmare." Those words were the last straw. On Friday morning, Grace snuck into the medical office during the shift change. She had 15 minutes before Elsa returned from her rounds. She took the bottle of painkillers meant for Marcus and carefully opened several capsules. The warfarin powder was white, almost indistinguishable from the contents of the pills. Grace mixed it with the medicine in a proportion that would guarantee death within a few hours. Her hands trembled as she sealed the capsules back up. "What am I doing?" she whispered to herself, but Marcus's voice in her head was louder. "You're my property." In the afternoon, Marcus complained of a headache. Grace brought him his pills personally, which was standard practice for prisoners requiring special supervision. "Thanks, sweetheart," he smiled as he took the pills. "You're so caring." Grace watched him swallow the capsules with water. Inside, she felt cold, but there was no turning back. "By the way," Marcus said as she was about to leave, "let's discuss a new plan tomorrow. I have some ideas on how to speed up my release." "Okay," Grace replied, surprised at how calm her voice sounded. The warfarin worked slowly. For the first few hours, Marcus felt fine and even had dinner in the common room, but by 8 o'clock he began to feel nauseous and dizzy. "I must have eaten something bad," he said to Jacob, the guard. "Can I have some water?" By 9, he was vomiting, and by 10, he complained of chest pains. The nurse on duty called Dr. Elsa, but by the time she arrived, Marcus was lying on the floor of his cell, clutching his chest. "Call an ambulance!" Elsa shouted, trying to feel his pulse, but it was too late. At 10:47 p.m., Marcus Reynolds was pronounced dead. Grace was at home when Douglas Hill called her. "Grace, we have a problem. Reynolds is dead." "What?" She tried to sound as surprised as possible. "It looks like a heart attack. Dr. Chen said it sometimes happens to young men under stress, but we'll need to investigate." "Of course. I'll be right there." When Grace arrived at the prison, the area was cordoned off. The police, the prosecutor's office, and the coroner had arrived. Marcus's body had already been taken to the morgue, but his cell had been sealed off as a crime scene. Detective David Cole, a heavy-set man in his 50s with tired eyes, was questioning the prison staff. When it was Grace's turn, she was ready for any questions. "Miss Mitchell, how long did you know the deceased?" "He arrived here a month ago. I conducted his initial orientation." "Did he have any problems with other inmates? Any threats?" "No, he adapted well. He didn't cause any trouble." "Any health problems?" "He sometimes complained of headaches. Dr. Chen prescribed painkillers for him." Cole wrote down the answers in his notebook. "When did you last see him?" "This afternoon I brought him his headache medicine." "How did he look?" "Normal. A little tired, but not sick." The detective nodded and let her go. Grace felt sweat breaking out on her back. but she remained calm on the outside. Douglas Hill was extremely concerned about what was happening. "This is a disaster for the institution's reputation," he said, pacing around his office. "A young, healthy man dies in our prison. The press will tear us apart." "People die of heart attacks," Grace said. "Even young people." "Yes, but not here. We haven't had a death in 3 years." Hill clearly wanted to hush the matter up as quickly as possible. He'd already contacted the district attorney's office to try to speed up the proceedings. But Dr. Elsa Chen wasn't so sure Marcus's death was natural. "Something's not right here," she said to Cole when they were alone. "Reynolds didn't have any heart problems. His cardiogram was perfect when he was admitted." "Stress can trigger an attack even in a healthy person," the detective replied. "Maybe, but the symptoms were strange. Vomiting, dizziness, then chest pains. It sounds more like poisoning." Cole raised an eyebrow. "Poisoning? Who could have poisoned him in prison?" "I don't know, but I insist on a full autopsy with toxicology. That will take time and money. Detective, if a man was murdered, we have a duty to find out." Cole sighed. He had seen enough deaths in prisons to know that most of them were natural or related to violence between inmates, but the doctor's insistence made him think. "All right, we'll order a full autopsy." When Grace heard about the decision to perform an autopsy, she felt her stomach clench with fear. The toxicology report would reveal the warfarin, and then the questions would start about how the poison had gotten into Marcus's system. But for now, she was safe. Marcus was dead, his blackmail was over, and there was no evidence linking them. She just had to hold out until the investigation was over. Grace lay awake at night, replaying the events of the day in her head. For the first time in weeks, she felt something like relief. The nightmare was over. Marcus would never again humiliate her, blackmail her, or make her life hell. But along with the relief came the realization of what she had done. She had killed a man. No matter what kind of monster he turned out to be, she had taken his life. And now, she would have to live with that burden for the rest of her life. In the morning, Detective Cole began a more detailed investigation. He interviewed all the inmates in Marcus's block, studied the CCTV footage, and checked who had access to his cell in the last days of his life. "Interesting," he said to his partner as he studied the visitor log. Senior guard Mitchell visited Reynolds quite often, more than the other inmates. Maybe he was causing trouble? Or the opposite. Everyone says he was a model prisoner. Cole decided to talk to Grace again, but in more detail. He had questions that needed answers. The autopsy results came back 4 days later. Dr. Elsa Chen was studying the pathologist's report when Detective Cole entered the medical office. "What did the tests show?" he asked, sitting down in a chair across from the doctor's desk. "Warfarin. The concentration in his blood was 20 times the therapeutic dose." Elsa took off her glasses and rubbed her nose. "This is definitely murder." Cole took out his notebook. "Is warfarin rat poison and rat?" "Among other things. It's also used as an anticoagulant in medicine, but in much smaller doses. That amount causes massive internal bleeding." "Where can you get warfarin in prison?" "The supply closet. That's where the rat poison is kept. But only senior staff have access to the supply room." Cole wrote down the information and looked up. "Who specifically?" "Warden Hill, Senior Guard Mitchell, Supply Manager Brown, and me as the Chief Medical Officer. 4 people. Which one of them could have had a motive for killing Reynolds?" Elsa thought for a moment. "Brown is an elderly man who has worked here for 15 years. He's quiet and doesn't get into conflicts. Hill had no direct contact with Reynolds. I treated him, but only professionally. That leaves Mitchell." "Grace," Elsa frowned. "She did spend more time with Reynolds than with the other inmates." "In what way?" "I saw them in the library after hours a few times." Grace explained it away as checking in on Reynolds' adjustment. He was a model prisoner, participating in educational programs. Cole was intrigued. "But something bothered you?" "Not that it bothered me. They just seemed too relaxed for a guard-prisoner relationship, as if they had established a relationship of trust. Or something more?" Elsa looked at the detective intently. "Are you suspecting a romantic relationship?" "I'm not suspecting anything yet. I'm gathering facts." After Cole left, Elsa returned to Marcus's medical records. Something was bothering her, but she couldn't figure out what it was. She looked through all his visits to the infirmary, his medication prescriptions, and his complaints about his health. Then her attention was drawn to an entry from last week. Patient complains of headache, painkillers prescribed, pills administered personally by senior guard Mitchell. Elsa remembered that this was unusual. Usually, medication was administered by medical staff or the guards on duty. Why had Grace taken on this role? Meanwhile, Cole was interviewing inmates from Marcus's block. Most spoke positively of the deceased. He helped with legal issues, didn't get into conflicts, and kept order. There was something strange about Mitchell, said Jenkins, Marcus's cellmate. What exactly? She talked to him a lot, for a long time, and not like she usually talked to prisoners, strictly and briefly. She was friendly. Were they friends? I don't know. But Marcus had changed in the last few weeks. He seemed more confident. He said he had influential connections who could help him get out early. Cole pricked up his ears. Did he name names? No, but he hinted at someone in the prison administration. That evening, the detective decided to talk to Grace again. He found her in her office sorting through documents. Miss Mitchell, can I bother you for a moment? Of course, Detective. Any news on the Reynolds case? Cole sat down and took out his notebook. The autopsy showed that Reynolds was poisoned with warfarin. It's murder. Grace tried to look surprised. Murder? But who could have killed him? Good question. The poison could only have entered his system through food or medication. Do you remember what Reynolds ate or took on the day he died? He complained of a headache. I brought him some painkillers. You personally? Yes. He was participating in educational programs, and I was supervising his adjustment. Cole wrote down the answer. Is it common practice to personally deliver medication to inmates? Grace sensed a trap in the question. Not common, but not prohibited either, for special cases. What made Reynolds a special case? He was a model prisoner. He didn't cause any problems and helped keep order among the other inmates. Other inmates say you spent an unusual amount of time with him. Grace's heart raced, but her voice remained steady. Reynolds was participating in several rehabilitation programs. He required additional supervision. In the library? After hours? Sometimes. He was motivated to educate himself. Cole studied her face, trying to detect signs of deception. Miss Mitchell, did you have a relationship with Reynolds that went beyond the professional? What do you mean? A romantic relationship, an intimate relationship. Grace looked him straight in the eye. Detective, that's an offensive assumption. I've worked in the correctional system for 18 years and have never violated professional ethics. I have to ask these questions. If there was nothing between you, would you mind if we looked into your finances, phone records, and email? Of course not. Look into anything you want. After the detective left, Grace locked her office door and leaned against it. Her hands were shaking. Cole suspected the truth, but he didn't have any proof yet. He had to hold on and not give himself away. The next day, Douglas Hill called the detective into his office. Cole, how long will this investigation continue? Until we find the killer. I understand, but the institution's reputation is at stake. Journalists are already interested in what's going on. Mr. Hill, a man was murdered. This is a serious crime. Yes, but perhaps we should consider suicide. Prisoners sometimes hide poison to end their lives. Cole shook his head. The concentration of warfarin was too high for self-administration. And where would a prisoner get rat poison? Maybe he worked in the maintenance department? Reynolds never had access to the storerooms. We checked. Hill was clearly nervous. Then maybe one of the inmates? A conflict? Revenge? We checked that too. Reynolds had no enemies among his fellow inmates. The conversation was interrupted by a ringing phone. Hill picked up the receiver. Yes, I understand. I'll be right there. He hung up and looked at the detective. That was the prosecutor's office. They want to conduct a search of the entire facility. While Hill ran around trying to minimize the damage, Elsa studied the medical records from the last few months. She noticed something strange. After Marcus's arrival, Grace had begun visiting the infirmary more often, asking about medications and inquiring about drugs. Interesting, the doctor muttered. finding a note that Grace had asked about the side effects of various medications. Elsa decided to check the warehouse stock. In the supply room, she discovered that one package of warfarin was missing. According to the records, all packages should have been there. "When did you notice it was missing?" she asked Brown, the warehouse manager. "I wouldn't have noticed if you hadn't asked. Who's going to count the rat poison every day?" "Who had access to the warehouse last week?" Brown looked at the log. "I did. Mr. Hill checked the inventory on Tuesday, and Miss Mitchell picked up the cleaning supplies on Wednesday." Elsa felt everything fall into place. Grace had been in the warehouse the day before Marcus died. She immediately called Detective Cole. "I have important information. Can you come over?" An hour later, Cole listened to the doctor's account of the missing warfarin and Grace's visit to the warehouse. "It's not proof yet," he said, "but it's serious evidence." "There's something else," Elsa said, pulling out Grace's medical records. "A month ago, she had tests done at the city hospital. She's HIV positive." "So what? If she and Reynolds were intimate, she could have infected him, and he could have started blackmailing her." Cole thought about it. The picture was starting to come together. "We need to check Reynolds' medical records." "I already did. Tests from 2 weeks ago show HIV infection. Fresh, recent. So there was definitely a connection between them." "It looks like it." That evening, Cole received the results of Grace's financial investigation. There were strange transfers on her account. $1,000 had been transferred to a prisoner's account 2 weeks ago. The recipient was Marcus Reynolds. Now the detective had the whole picture. A romantic relationship, HIV infection, blackmail, murder. All that remained was to get a confession. The next morning, Cole arrived at the prison with an arrest warrant. Grace was working in her office when there was a knock at the door. "Grace Mitchell, you are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Marcus Reynolds." Grace turned pale but did not resist. "You have the right to remain silent." While Cole read her rights, Grace thought about how quickly her whole life was falling apart. Just yesterday, she was a respected employee, and today, she was a murder suspect. At the police station, she was placed in an interrogation room. Cole sat down across from her and laid out the documents on the table. "Grace, we have evidence linking you to Reynolds. Blood tests show that you were both HIV positive, your financial transfers to his account, evidence of your meetings." Grace remained silent. "We know he was blackmailing you, threatened to reveal your relationship. You transferred money to him, but it wasn't enough." Silence. "You took warfarin from the warehouse and mixed it into his medication. You wanted his death to look natural." Cole leaned closer. "Grace, I understand that you were driven to desperation. Reynolds used your feelings, infected you with his disease, then blackmailed you. Anyone in your position could have broken down." For the first time during the interrogation, Grace looked up. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "Then explain." Grace was silent for a long time, then spoke. "He wasn't who he said he was. The first few weeks, he seemed kind and understanding. I was lonely after my divorce and believed he was sincere." Cole wrote down her statement. "When did the intimate relationship begin?" 3 weeks ago, I thought I loved him, that he loved me. But then everything changed. When I found out about the HIV and told him, he turned into a monster. He demanded money, threatened to tell my boss, humiliated me." "And you decided to kill him?" Grace nodded. "I knew he would never let me go. Even after he was released, he would have continued to blackmail me." "Tell me how it happened." "I took some warfarin from the warehouse and mixed it with painkillers. I brought it to him as if it were his usual medicine." Cole finished recording and looked at Grace. "Do you regret what you did?" Grace thought for a moment. "I regret believing him. I regret letting my emotions get the better of me. But I don't regret stopping him. He was a predator who destroyed people's lives." The trial took place 6 months later. Grace pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. Considering the circumstances of the case, blackmail, emotional coercion, lack of premeditation, she was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Douglas Hill was fired for trying to cover up the circumstances of the prisoner's death. Elsa Chen continued her work as a doctor, but at a different institution. Detective Cole closed the case, but he couldn't forget the story for a long time. There was too much human pain, loneliness, and despair in it. and Grace Mitchell began serving her sentence in the very institution where she had worked for almost 20 years. Now she was on the other side of the bars, in a world she knew but which had become completely different to her.